Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Tonight's top story is about increasingly deteriorating relations between China and the United States, the world's two top economies. The U.S. National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, says, and I quote from what he said, "I think Taiwan needs to start looking at some asymmetric and anti-access area denial strategies and really fortify itself in a manner that would deter the Chinese from any sort of amphibious invasion or even a gray zone operation against them," unquote. He was speaking to an online Aspen Institute forum. It's important to mention that while the 1979 United States People's Republic of China joint communique switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, and the U.S. acknowledged the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act provides the legal basis for the unofficial relationship between the United States and Taiwan and commits the U.S. to assist Taiwan in maintaining its defensive capability. Meanwhile, the Chinese government has warned Washington it may detain Americans in China in response to the Justice Department's prosecution of Chinese military-affiliated scholars. This was reported by the U.S. newspaper, The Wall Street Journal, which cited unnamed officials as saying that China had issued repeated warnings through multiple channels to U.S. government officials. The paper said China's message was the United States should end prosecutions of Chinese scholars in U.S. courts, or Americans in China could find themselves in violation of Chinese law. The two countries have also resorted to tit-for-tat sanctions against companies and individuals. They are at loggerheads over developments in Hong Kong and South China Sea. There's also the issue of the trade war, etc., etc. So things aren't exactly looking up. And even if the Oval Office goes to former Vice President Joe Biden, still an if, the U.S. policy towards China is unlikely to see a major change. So let's get to our panel of experts. We are joined by Shaun, author and founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, and Ross Feingold, head of business development at SafePro Group, and he joins us from Taipei. Thank you to both my guests here. Let me begin with Shaun here. Shaun, let's begin with the Taiwan issue, what O'Brien has said. Why do you think he said that? I mean, what's the real sort of, pressure there in terms of any new developments?
We've talked about this before. It's quite clear that the Trump regime is trying to contain China's economic and political growth. It's a very dangerous situation. But since we last spoke, what we've seen is that the United States has really been acting like a rogue regime. They're really a bad actor right now, and they're trying to provoke China to cause a problem in Taiwan. So here in Shanghai, where I live, over the last month, a lot of the military jets are rumored to have been flying up to intercept about 60 American spy planes that have flown off the coast of China. Now imagine if the roles were reversed and China sent 60 spy planes off the coast of Florida. The Mike Pompeo, O'Brien would all be screaming for blood. So when it comes to Taiwan, the United States is very close to crossing what I would consider to be a red line for the Chinese. They've already sent the Health Services Secretary, Azar, to Taiwan. The Taiwanese rep to the United States is now calling herself an ambassador, even though she's not. That's the actual definition. She calls herself on Twitter. So the United States is really ratcheting up pressure on China via Taiwan. And let me be very clear, this is dangerous. China will back down with India. China will back down with the South China Sea because it doesn't want to have a war with other nations. It wants to come and find common ground. But when it comes to national sovereignty issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, this is when the Chinese will do whatever it takes to maintain what they consider to be their territorial integrity. The United States really needs to back down. It's quite concerning how aggressive the Trump regime has become in the last month.
Right. So let me also get Ross Feingold's view on this, and then we can further proceed in this discussion. Ross Feingold.
Well, the view from here in Taiwan is that O'Brien made that comment just in the overall context of U.S. government officials, U.S. policy with regard to Taiwan, that is largely in response to actions that China is taking. And it's certainly widely reported about the increase in Chinese air and naval exercises around Taiwan. So it's understandable that the United States would encourage Taiwan to take appropriate measures to prepare for its own defense. And frankly, part of that will be cooperation with the U.S., whether it's in the form of weapon sales by the United States to Taiwan, which are authorized, or some would say required, by the Taiwan Relations Act in order to maintain Taiwan's defensive, not offensive, but defensive capability, or statements encouraging Taiwan to invest more in its national defense. This is a very normal response, whether from the government of Taiwan or the government of the United States, when they see that the threat level from China towards Taiwan is increasing. And again, that's just the reality. On the water, in the air, we see actions by China to increase the military threat level for Taiwan. So a response from Taiwan and the U.S. should not be a surprise.
Right. But interesting enough, when Mr. O'Brien was pressed about, why he had said what he was saying, and whether he was concerned that China could launch an amphibious invasion of Taiwan or employ non-military means to subdue the island, O'Brien said he did not think, and I'm quoting from what he said, the Chinese probably at this point want or likely are prepared for an amphibious landing. So it seems to me, Ross Feingold, it does seem to me that this is more in line with the overall policy that the Trump administration has formulated to pressure China rather than any particular Chinese threat to the island.
Well, certainly the United States is concerned about Chinese actions across a range of issues that you identified, whether it's sovereignty disputes in not just Taiwan, but South China Sea. India, the relationship with the U.S. is certainly improving in recent times, consistent with the rise in tensions along the India-China border, trade, human rights. All the issues are well known, but again, for a senior government official from the United States government who's involved in national security issues to make a statement about Taiwan preparing for its defense, that's not unusual, and it's certainly not unusual at this time given the level of military activity from China. But I think we also have to put O'Brien's statement in context when he says that China might not be ready or planning an amphibious invasion anytime soon, not the next day or the next week. That doesn't mean China isn't planning on it. In fact, just the opposite. I mean, China has said they will use force to prevent Taiwan's de jure declaration of independence. So, what the message from the U.S. is that maybe China doesn't have the military capability at this moment to do an amphibious invasion, but we shouldn't kid ourselves and say that China's not working on that. In fact, China is rapidly improving all of its military capabilities.
Right. So, Shaun, Rein, once again, it seems to me that it's more like scenario building, in keeping with the overall policy that you just talked about, and which we have discussed previously also on this program. And I say this because O'Brien went on to say, and once again I'm quoting from what he said, it would be a hard operation for the Chinese to do, and Beijing would have to consider how the United States would respond. And to that question, his exact words were, if we got involved, that can make that a very dangerous effort for the Chinese to engage in. So on the one hand, this is scenario building within the overall framework of the policy as formulated by the Trump administration. And on the other hand, it's a not so veiled threat to China. So it seems to me that the threat perception is not a one-way traffic here.
Exactly. I think you and I are in agreement on this. I think the United States is very good at scenario building. They say this country could be a threat. China could be a threat. Gaddafi could be a threat. Saddam Hussein could be a threat. Then they don't necessarily see what any of these countries are actually doing. It's what the potential could be. And then the United States goes into warmonger mode, gets everybody in the U.S. on both the Republican and the Democrat side, because the only thing that they can agree on is that China is evil and China is the enemy. And they start building up this warmongering case. We've seen it ever since the end of World War II. China has gone to war against 37 countries, while China has gone to war against 0 since the end of 1979. China has one military base outside of mainland China. The United States has convinced its population, convinced Americans that it's a peaceful nation, yet it's probably one of the most warlike nations in the history of the world. Endless wars, and it's exactly as you said, it's scenario planning. It's what China might be. But as you said, O'Brien discounts China's ability to even invade Taiwan. You know, John Brennan, the former CIA director, said that China's version of the CIA is sort of third tier, might be starting to come up to second tier, but is really not in the big leagues like the United States and some of the other Western powers. So basically, at the end of the day, we've got fear-mongering here. We don't have actual proof of anything that China is doing that's truculent, that's aggressive. It's the United States building a case, as they always do, to militarize. And you see, Lockheed Martin, a big American weapons manufacturer, just sold hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment, military equipment, to Taiwan.
Right. So, Feingold, on the issue of sovereignty, for instance, we have seen what the Trump administration has done with the International Criminal Court prosecutors, because the United States thinks that any kind of investigation into its war conduct and prosecution is against the idea of U.S. sovereignty. So how is it that something that the U.S. wants to preserve so much for itself, and perhaps rightly so, all countries do, is something that it will deny China, and especially after the 1979 joint communique that I talked about?
Well, we have to keep in mind that the 1979 or the earlier communiques during the 1970s, or the ones after that, the documentation that underlines the U.S. People's Republic of China relationship. When the United States says it acknowledges the Chinese position, that doesn't mean it agrees with the Chinese position. So that's a very significant distinction to keep in mind. But regardless of various other situations, and of course, it's always very difficult to compare actions or events in history or current events involving sovereignty disputes or disputes over the authority of international organizations like the International Criminal Court. The reality is that Taiwan and China have been ruled separately since the end of the Civil War. The people here on Taiwan have clearly expressed a preference not to be incorporated into the People's Republic of China at present, at least while the political systems are so dramatically different. And I think it's fair to say that among democratic countries in Asia or around the world, further afield, like in Western Europe or Australia, that they support that the people of Taiwan's view should be respected, and that the long-term solution between the status of Taiwan is certainly not something that should be settled by the use of force. And again, we should not get away from the fact that the People's Republic of China has in fact threatened to use force if Taiwan did declare de jure independence. And again, I think that's a solution that nobody would like to see, the use of force to settle this issue.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ross Feingold speaking with us. Let me go back to Shaun Rein. Shaun, let's move to the other issue on the table, which is the Chinese telling the United States to not proceed and not prosecute PLA-affiliated scholars. Otherwise, there's going to be, a quid for that quo. Tell me something about that.
Well, it's a difficult situation. Right now, we're going off of rumors, and the Wall Street Journal is known as being sort of anti-China and not being particularly biased. But they've reported that the United States government has said, and they use unnamed sources, has said that China has threatened to arrest American scholars and American citizens in China right now in a tit-for-tat measure, because the United States has been detaining scores and scores of Chinese academics in the United States. They've also been booting out hundreds of Chinese scholars who are studying in the U.S. who are affiliated with Chinese military universities. So there's been a war of words. I don't know what the truth is, but it's definitely a very difficult situation. Now, I'm a very proud American. I'm living in China for 23 years, and I feel perfectly safe here. I wouldn't want to go back to the United States where 8 million people have been sickened with COVID. But I'm not concerned about China just going out and arresting random Americans off of the street. But it's very clear that the United States is first going into this hostage diplomacy, arresting people, booting people out, booting journalists out. It's really been precipitated by the United States, not really by China. China just wants to focus on recovering from COVID and making money.
Right. As I said, Wall Street Journal story does not name its sources. It's about unnamed Chinese officials. We are also joined by Dr. Kamran Bukhari, who is Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. Thank you, Kamran Bukhari, for being on the program. We're discussing the couple of things that we're pegging this on, the US-China relations, which are obviously deteriorating. One is the NSA, US NSA O'Brien's statement about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan when he spoke to the Aspen Institute online forum. And then, of course, we're just discussing, as you were listening in, I was discussing with Shaun Rein, this Wall Street Journal story about, quoting unnamed Chinese officials saying that China will go for a tit-for-tat if the U.S. prosecutes Chinese scholars in the U.S. So just give us a broad overview of how you're looking at all this.
Well, Ejaz, I think that the situation between China and the United States is in a bit of a slow motion escalation, if I may use that phraseology. But the bottom line is, look, China is advancing, is rising as a power, as a regional power, and especially on the Eurasian landmass. Obviously, that puts it into conflict with the United States. So both sides need to be able to deal with each other. They're trade partners as well, so not just adversaries. So this is a small part. These two reports or these two developments, a statement from the National Security Advisor of the Trump administration, as well as this story in the Wall Street Journal, seem to me as a form of signaling. I'm pretty sure, and I wouldn't be surprised that if the Wall Street Journal sources are indeed Chinese officials, they're not actually threatening anything. They're just sending a message that, look, if you escalate, then we're going to, respond accordingly. Likewise, the National Security Advisor here in Washington is essentially signaling to the Chinese that if you have any designs on Taiwan, because they've just pushed into India as well, and you and I have talked about that aspect of the Chinese, push on a geopolitical front. So the Americans are saying, look, we're watching. So both sides are signaling to each other that, we can, neither side wants escalation that goes out of hand. And so these are the steps that are taken ahead of time to let the other side know that, look, we're not going to take things lying down.
Right. Do you think, and I mentioned this in my opening, that if Joe Biden goes into White House, he wins it. Of course, it's a big if. Do you think that there's going to be any subtle changes in the president policy? I mean, I know that there's a bipartisan consensus inside the Beltway as far as China is concerned, but I'm talking more about, the U.S. probably having a more nuanced policy as far as China is concerned, rather than the sort of, the bull in the China shop, if you will, policy of Mr. Trump.
No, I think you're right. I think that, Walter Russell Mead, who's a prominent American strategic thinker, a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal wrote a column in which he basically said, look, Trump administration was great at disruption, as disruption of business as usual in U.S. foreign policy, in geopolitics around the world. But whether Trump gets reelected or Biden comes into the White House, the next administration will have to come up with a strategy to deal with this new reality. And I think that President Trump has created a dynamic. The next administration, if Joe Biden becomes president, will have to factor that into his policy. I mean, he can't start from scratch. He can't go back to status quo ante. There is a reality on the ground. China has moved way beyond when the last time when Joe Biden was in the White House serving as VP to President Obama. So everything that's happened during the Trump administration just can't be wished away. So what I'm trying to say here is that any policy that the Biden administration formulates, however nuanced it is, that just can't sort of say, okay, the last 4 years did not happen.
Right. I wrap up. Let me go back to Shaun Rein. Shaun Rein, your thoughts on how it might look like under Joe Biden?
I agree with the other guest. I don't consider Biden to be a friend of China. I don't think he's racist. I don't think he's a warmonger. But I think the reality is you can't wish away the last 4 years. The problem is there's been so much mistrust built on the Chinese side towards the U.S. that the Chinese view the Americans have not been acting rationally, that China is going to continue to try to forge stronger alliances with other nations like Pakistan, is going to continue to try to focus on self-reliance and indigenous innovation. And what's really worrisome to me is in the United States, you look at the hawks are not Trump himself. It's the people around Trump. It's people in the military machine. It's people at the State Department. And most importantly, it's American senators like Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who's running for re-election uncontested against a Democrat. It's people like Josh Hawley. So I think even if Biden comes in, he's not going to be able to fix U.S.-China relations anytime soon, especially because his first focus for the next year or two is going to be on containing COVID and resurrecting the economy that Trump has really destroyed in the last 6 months by not acknowledging the severity of COVID-19.
Right. Thank you so much, Shaun Rein. Thank you, Dr. Kamran Bukhari. We shall take a short break and return to discuss U.S. policy on Afghanistan and the situation in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about the differences between President Donald Trump's top military chief and National Security Advisor over U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. The disagreement is now in the open. In different public appearances, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley have contradicted each other on whether U.S. troops will withdraw. One U.S. media outlet described it as a marked display of chaos surrounding Trump's push to end the 19-year-old war in the weeks before the 2020 election. Trump himself has added to the confusion with his tweet about bringing troops home by Christmas. Meanwhile, the Taliban have warned the United States of consequences if it does not stop bombing areas other than combat zones in Afghanistan. In a statement, the Taliban said that though a peace deal prohibits the U.S. forces from conducting airstrikes in non-combat areas, and the U.S. military has violated that commitment on numerous occasions over the past few days. The spokesman for the U.S. forces had disputed the Taliban claim, saying airstrikes were carried out to defend Afghan troops against Taliban attacks. To discuss what's going on, we are joined by Elizabeth Threlkeld, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer and currently a senior fellow and deputy director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. We also have with us Dr. Rifaat Hussain, head of public policy department, the National University of Science and Technology. Thank you to both guests. Let me begin with Elizabeth Threlkeld here. What exactly is going on? Because, there was General Milley gave an interview to National Public Radio in which he said that this is not a matter of speculation and I'm going to apply a rigorous analysis to the situation. And then O'Brien fired back saying, it's not speculation as someone has suggested. And I've been talking to the president and that's what the president wants.
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, this sort of uncertainty makes a challenging peace process even more difficult in Afghanistan. These are dynamics that we've seen play out over the course of the last 6 months, certainly, and beyond that in terms of the military seeking a conditions-based approach, and as well as the State Department. This is kind of a standard talking point of Zalmay Khalilzad, for example. But simultaneously, I think politics are playing into this to a certain extent, particularly ahead of the November election. And so some of the public statements, the confusion, it certainly is more out in the open than it has been before. But that is kind of the underlying dynamic as best that I can tell. But certainly it is an issue that will be continuing to develop over the next few weeks.
Right. Would you consider General Milley's interview or what he stated with reference to the National Security Advisor as something which is unprecedented, or is this something that, has happened before?
I think it is part of a continuing trend that we've seen. At the end of the day, this is something that we're all grappling with on issues like Afghanistan, but more broadly, when policy is made by tweet. Obviously, the president is the commander-in-chief, and the National Security Advisor speaks for him. But until those orders go through a more formal process, the policy of the military and as General Milley articulated has long been that it will be a conditions-based approach. So, I think the fact that this is happening so openly is significant, but given the political timelines, given the broader tensions, perhaps not surprising at this juncture.
Right. Just to corroborate what Elizabeth Threlkeld is saying, let me just quote from a document that I have, which is U.S. officials, including General Mark Milley and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have vowed that withdrawal would be conditions-based, including a reduction in violence, although that commitment isn't explicit in the agreement. Let's get to Dr. Rifaat Hussain here. Dr. Hussain, how do you look at, we know that inside the Beltway, there have generally been multiple shops dealing with issues. But in this particular case, it seems that the situation is more chaotic. And as Elizabeth Threlkeld mentioned, also basically pushing out policy on Twitter. That's increasingly the case. Now it's almost everywhere in the world. I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it certainly is the case. So how do you look at the situation within the United States in terms of the approach to Afghanistan? Of course, we'll also come to the talks in Doha. But first, let me get your reading on this.
My understanding that this confusion that we are finding in terms of these contradictory statements one by President Trump and the few hours before he sent out that tweet, Robert Rein had clearly stated that the American troop withdrawal is on course, and by 2021 there will be at least 2,000 and 2,500 American soldiers left. But then Trump's tweet in which he said that he would expect the American troops to be home by Christmas. So that created amount of confusion regarding this. But I think that I would take the Mike Milley's assertion very seriously, even though Robert Rein said that, he's engaging in speculation. But, Mike Milley would be the person who would be the point person, because somebody who will be overseeing the withdrawal schedule. And, he's quite categoric that, there is nothing in the Trump tweet which will indicate to him that the Americans are serious by withdrawing forces from Afghanistan by Christmas. Even if the Americans would want to withdraw, which will be unprecedented withdrawal, my question is that, logistically it is not possible for the United States to step back and leave Afghanistan by Christmas. So even if Trump wins the next election, which seems very difficult, and if he wants to withdraw troops by Christmas, even then he would need at least 3 to 4 months to make sure that the America does not leave a legacy which can be picked up by the Taliban or others. No, this is something about which Pakistan has also been concerned. Pakistani leadership has made it clear to the Americans that they would not want a precipitous draw from Afghanistan, and and none of the other countries, including China and Russia, who would want to see the Americans leave Afghanistan, would want to leave them Afghanistan in an abrupt manner.
Right. Let me go back to Elizabeth Threlkeld. Elizabeth, Dr. Rifaat Hussain is right. I mean, General Milley is the man because it's going to be his input in terms of how this will come about. But this assumes, when it comes to Trump's administration, I would presume somewhat arbitrarily, that this administration works in and through the existing mechanisms. Well, I guess lots of officials try to do that, and they must be getting frustrated, but certainly the president himself does not really work in and through the existing mechanisms. So is there a level of frustration within the administration, among the officials, with reference to how the president actually operates?
Based on certainly what we've seen in the press, the fact that these sorts of stories are coming out suggests some sort of discontent, but this is part of the process that we've seen. Back over the summer, for example, there were some reports coming out that we would be down to 0 troops by the election, that was something the president was interested in. But simultaneously, there were reports that we would do a withdrawal down to the 4,500 troops by November. And that position ultimately won the day. And so even though there were these competing reports, there was some sort of process going on internally, certainly. And I would imagine a similar process is playing out behind the scenes now. With regard specifically to the troops home by Christmas tweet, Robert O'Brien subsequently termed that kind of aspirational, but that was something that the president wished for, just like previous presidents had wished for troops to be home. So that read to me as a little bit of backtracking on that tweet. So I think over the coming weeks, we will see the position clarified, particularly around the election. That is the big attention getter in Washington and around the world, certainly. But for now, I think going forward, we can expect to see more of the same in terms of perhaps a more open debate about these issues than is traditional.
Right. Dr. Hussain, let's get to the other issue, which is what the Taliban have said. They've used pretty strong words, the statement, with reference to what they allege are U.S. bombings in non-combat areas. Of course, as I said in my opening, the U.S. Forces spokesperson has refuted that. How serious is this, with reference to the talks itself and what's happening on the ground?
Well, Ejaz, the Americans have launched their airstrikes, and the Taliban are saying that they have ended up killing more than 30 civilians in these strikes. So this is something which is a clear violation of the understanding that they had with the Americans. But on the other hand, the Americans are saying that the Taliban are engaging in military attacks, which not only involve the attacks on the Afghan security forces, but somehow these attacks may involve even some of the American helicopters and the Air Force and the American combat troops. So there's quite a bit of a confusion as to what is going on actually on the ground. But the reality is, I think we are beginning to see interpretation that are being these military moves, whether it is from the Taliban side or from the American side. And I think this is something for concern. And we indeed have now Zalmay Khalils are saying that if these attacks continue, there is no reduction in violence, then this could very well lead to the derailment of the peace process. So it's in that context that I would look at this situation. There is quite a bit of a confusion. The Taliban have said that the Americans are targeting civilians, which is a violation of the Doha Agreement, and the Americans have denied it. So we have to wait and see what is actually happening on the ground.
Right. There is a lot of confusion. But let me, before I wrap up, go back to Elizabeth Threlkeld on this. It seems to me that there is a mechanism. I mean, the American military obviously would provide evidence of what they're doing or why they're doing that. The Taliban are in talks. They are in contact with the Americans. They're also talking to the other Afghans. So it seems to me that unless there is an attempt on one side or both sides to sort of make it even more intractable than it already is, that it should be solved at some point. Give me your sense of how you're looking at this development.
I think for the past 6 months, more now actually, we've heard differing interpretations of what was actually agreed on February 29th between the U.S. and the Taliban. The U.S. has maintained that the agreement included some sort of provisions around reduction in violence. At least in the 4-page public document that's been released, that is not the case. It refers specifically to the Taliban's counterterrorism commitments, but doesn't actually mention a reduction in violence, except for the fact that a ceasefire would be on the agenda in intra-Afghan talks. And so there are some discussions of separate agreements that were reached or private annexes, for example. And in the statement that Zalmay Khalilzad made about the reset that the U.S. and the Taliban had supposedly agreed to in order to reduce the really unfortunate levels of violence that are going on, he seemed to be suggesting that it was not just the U.S. Taliban agreement itself, but actually these side commitments as well to reduce violence that the U.S. was calling on. And so, this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And unfortunately, the Afghan people are those that are suffering as a result of these attacks right now. But as negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government continue, I think this will continue to be an issue between the U.S. and the Taliban because it is, at the end of the day, a 3-sided interaction, and only 2 sides are at the table right now. But the U.S. is certainly looming large in terms of the ongoing fighting that we're seeing in Afghanistan and the potential troop withdrawal.
Right. This is, as I said, becoming even more intractable. Dr. Hussain, before I finally wrap up, there are other actors involved in this. The Chinese have been talking to the Taliban. We're facilitating the process. Qataris are involved in that, and the other actors also. So perhaps, these are the actors that can actually or try to pressure the Taliban into some kind of reduction in violence. You think that is possible given the situation on the ground and Taliban's own strategy, or is it just wishful thinking?
No, I think this is a real problem, and Zalmay Khalilzad himself, in his, I think, comments about 24 hours ago, in which he said that he will try to gain support of what he described as the international support group, so which essentially means Afghanistan's neighbors, China and Russia, and and Iran, and Abdullah has just concluded a visit to Iran, in which he has been able to engage with the Iranian leadership. And I should say that as we talk, we also have the Hizb Islami leader.
Yes,
he's in Pakistan.
Correct.
So these are the efforts that are underway to mobilize real support for the Afghan peace process. And I think that whether the Zalmay Khalilzad succeeds in that or not, but the effort is worth considering, and without the support of the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, I don't think that Afghanistan peace process can be sustained in a meaningful way.
Can be sustained. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Rifaat Hussain. Thank you to Elizabeth Threlkeld for her insights. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.